Ferdinand Marcos, Visionary Leader or Corrupt Tyrant, Part 1, Early Life and Family Background. Ferdinand Emmanuel Edrelin Marcos was born on September 11, 1917, in the quaint and unassuming town of Sarat, located in the province of Ilocos Norte in the northernmost reaches of the Philippine archipelago. The region, known for its rugged landscapes and deeply rooted traditions, provided the backdrop for Ferdinand's early years. It was a place where ancestral legacies, family ties, and political ambitions intertwined, shaping the character of one of the most controversial figures in Philippine history. Ferdinand was the son of Mariano Marcos and Josefa Edrelin, whose lives and stories embodied the complexities of their era. Mariano Marcos, born in 1897, was a man of ambition and intellect. As a lawyer and politician, he served as a congressman representing Ilocos Norte, a position that brought him both respect and notoriety in equal measure. Mariano was not merely a figure of legal expertise but also a staunch nationalist who sought to assert the Philippines' sovereignty during a period of American colonial rule. His speeches and writings revealed a passionate belief in Filipino self-determination, and his legal acumen made him a formidable presence in the halls of the Philippine legislature. However, his career would eventually be overshadowed by the tumultuous events of World War II. When Japan occupied the Philippines in 1941, the country became a battleground of conflicting allegiances. Mariano, whose political aspirations had once focused on the betterment of his province and country, found himself accused of collaborating with the Japanese invaders. The accusations against him centered on claims that he had acted as a propagandist for the Japanese military, promoting their occupation policies to the Filipino populace. These charges, whether fully substantiated or politically motivated, sealed his fate. In 1945, as the Japanese forces faced mounting resistance from Filipino guerrillas, Mariano was captured and subjected to a horrific execution. He was drawn and quartered using carabaos, an act of symbolic punishment that reflected the deep resentment harbored by Filipinos against collaborators. His remains were left to hang from a tree, a stark and grim reminder of the moral complexities of war and the ruthless consequences of perceived betrayal. Josefa Edrelin Marcos, born in 1893, was the daughter of a prominent family in Ilocos Norte. She pursued a career in education, becoming a school teacher, a role that allowed her to shape young minds in her community. Unlike her husband, Josefa lived a long life, witnessing the sweeping changes that marked the mid-20th century in the Philippines. After Mariano's tragic death, Josefa became the anchor of the Marcos family, ensuring that her children would not only survive but thrive. Her resilience and determination were evident in the way she navigated the challenges of widowhood during a period of national upheaval. She lived to see her son Ferdinand rise to the pinnacle of political power, becoming president of the Philippines in 1965. However, she also bore witness to his downfall in 1986, when the People Power Revolution forced the Marcos family to flee the country. Left behind in Malacanang Palace during their hurried departure, Josefa spent her final years away from the political spotlight, passing away in 1988, 2 years after the family's exile and just 1 year before Ferdinand's death. Ferdinand's early life was marked by stories, both factual and embellished, that painted a picture of a lineage steeped in heroism and adventure. One of the most enduring claims he made about his ancestry was a supposed connection to Antonio Luna, the fiery and brilliant general who played a pivotal role in the Philippine-American War. Luna, known for his tactical genius and fierce nationalism, was a figure of inspiration for many Filipinos. However, Ferdinand's claim to be a descendant of Luna was debunked by genealogists, most notably Mona Magnovelas, who traced the Marcos family lineage with precision and found no evidence to support this assertion. Despite the lack of factual basis, the claim served Ferdinand well, allowing him to associate himself with a legacy of courage and patriotism. Another intriguing, though equally dubious, claim made by Ferdinand was that his ancestry included Limahong, a notorious 16th-century Chinese pirate. Lima Hong, whose real name was Lin Feng, was a legendary figure who led daring raids along the coasts of the South China Sea and established a brief but tumultuous foothold in the Philippines. By aligning himself with such a storied figure, Ferdinand sought to underscore a narrative of daring, resourcefulness, and resilience, traits that he often projected in his public persona. While historians and genealogists have cast doubt on this claim, it underscores Ferdinand's penchant for crafting a mythology around his identity, blending elements of truth, fiction, and ambition. The Marcos family, like many prominent families in the Philippines, had Chinese mestizo roots. The Chinese mestizo community played a significant role in shaping the country's history, economy, and politics. This heritage, characterized by a blending of Filipino and Chinese traditions, influenced Ferdinand's upbringing and worldview. It also placed him within a broader narrative of Filipino leaders who navigated complex identities, balancing local traditions with the cosmopolitan influences brought by centuries of trade, colonization, and migration. In the provincial town of Sarat, Ferdinand's childhood was shaped by the cultural and historical milieu of Ilocos Norte. The Ilocano people, known for their industriousness and resilience, were deeply rooted in their traditions, but they were also attuned to the winds of change sweeping through the country. The young Ferdinand grew up amidst the stories of Spanish colonization, American imperialism, and the burgeoning nationalist movement that sought to define a new Filipino identity. These influences, combined with his family's political legacy and personal ambition, laid the foundation for a life that would profoundly impact the course of Philippine history. Part 2: Education and Early Achievements. Ferdinand Marcos's educational journey is often presented as a testament to his remarkable intellect, ambition, and determination. Born into a family that valued education and intellectual pursuits, Ferdinand was groomed to excel academically from an early age. His mother, Josefa Edrelin, a schoolteacher by profession, played a pivotal role in instilling a love for learning in her children. She encouraged rigorous academic discipline and fostered an environment where intellectual achievement was celebrated. For Ferdinand, this early foundation became the bedrock upon which he built his future ambitions. Marcos's educational path began in Ilocos Norte, where he attended local schools that emphasized traditional values and academic excellence. These formative years in a provincial setting imbued him with a strong sense of discipline and an early exposure to the challenges of leadership. As a young student, Ferdinand demonstrated an aptitude for learning that set him apart from his peers. Teachers and classmates alike were struck by his sharp mind, photographic memory, and eloquence in speech, a combination of traits that would later define his political persona. After completing his primary and secondary education, Ferdinand sought greater opportunities for intellectual growth. In pursuit of higher education, he moved to Manila, the capital of the Philippines, to enroll at the prestigious University of the Philippines, UP. At the UP College of Law, Marcos began to carve out a reputation as a brilliant but fiercely ambitious student. The university, widely regarded as a bastion of academic excellence and intellectual rigor, attracted the nation's most promising minds, and Ferdinand quickly established himself as a standout figure among them. At UP, Marcos's academic performance was exceptional. He excelled not only in his coursework but also in extracurricular activities that showcased his diverse talents and charismatic leadership. He joined the university's swimming, boxing, and wrestling teams, demonstrating a competitive spirit that extended beyond the classroom. His physical prowess and determination in these sports mirrored his approach to intellectual challenges, methodical, relentless, and driven by a desire to emerge victorious. These qualities earned him the admiration of his peers and professors, who recognized his potential for greatness. In addition to his athletic pursuits, Ferdinand was an accomplished orator and debater. His skills in public speaking were honed through participation in university debates and writing for the student newspaper. His eloquence, coupled with a deep understanding of legal and political issues, positioned him as a leading voice among his contemporaries. It was during this time that Ferdinand's ability to command attention and sway opinions became evident, a skill he would later wield with great effect in his political career. One of the defining moments of Ferdinand's time at UP was his membership in the Upsilon Sigma Phi, an exclusive fraternity known for its roster of influential members, many of whom would go on to occupy prominent positions in government, business, and academia. The fraternity served as a network of connections that Ferdinand skillfully leveraged to further his ambitions. Within the fraternity, he forged relationships with individuals who would later become his allies and, in some cases, his staunchest critics. These connections underscored the intricate interplay of camaraderie and rivalry that marked Ferdinand's ascent in Philippine society. In 1939, Ferdinand's academic prowess reached its zenith when he sat for the Philippine bar examinations. His performance was nothing short of extraordinary. He emerged as a bar top-notcher, achieving an impressive score of 92.35%. This feat was celebrated as a remarkable achievement, earning him widespread recognition and solidifying his reputation as a legal prodigy. The distinction of being a bar top-notcher opened doors to opportunities that would have otherwise remained out of reach, providing Ferdinand with a platform to launch his career in law and politics. Ferdinand's accomplishments during his time at UP extended beyond academic accolades. He graduated cum laude, a testament to his dedication and intellectual excellence. He was also elected to the Pi Gamma Mu and Phi Kappa Phi International Honor Societies, prestigious organizations that recognized his scholastic achievements and leadership potential. Decades later, in a gesture that underscored his enduring legacy, the Phi Kappa Phi Society would honor him with its Most Distinguished Member Award, a recognition that reflected both his contributions to Philippine society and the enduring impact of his educational journey. In addition to his formal education, Ferdinand received an honorary Doctor of Laws, LLD, degree from Central Philippine University in 1967. This honor highlighted the widespread acknowledgement of his intellectual contributions and legal expertise. It also underscored his role as a public figure whose influence extended beyond the confines of law into the broader realms of governance and national development. Ferdinand Marcos's academic journey was not without controversy and challenges. His rise was marked by a mix of genuine brilliance and calculated ambition, qualities that earned him both admiration and skepticism. His ability to navigate complex social and political landscapes, combined with his exceptional intellectual capabilities, laid the foundation for a career that would ultimately redefine the trajectory of the Philippines. The University of the Philippines was not merely an institution where Ferdinand honed his legal skills, it was a crucible in which he forged the character and vision that would guide him throughout his life. The friendships, rivalries, and achievements of his university years shaped his worldview and prepared him for the challenges that lay ahead. It was here that Ferdinand Marcos transformed from a promising young student into a figure destined to leave an indelible mark on Philippine history. Part 3: The assassination of Julio Nalundasan and Marcos's early legal challenges. One of the most infamous and consequential episodes in Ferdinand Marcos's early life was his involvement in the murder case of Julio Nalundasan, a political rival of his father, Mariano Marcos. This dramatic and controversial chapter not only thrust the young Marcos into the national spotlight but also became a defining moment in his legal and personal journey, showcasing his intellect, resourcefulness, and capacity for navigating perilous situations. The rivalry between Nalundasan and Mariano Marcos. Julio Nalundasan was a prominent figure in Ilocos Norte's political landscape during the 1930s. As a member of the Nacionalista Party, he stood in direct opposition to Mariano Marcos, who was a staunch supporter of the Democratic Party. The two men represented contrasting visions for the future of the province, and their rivalry was marked by intense competition, fiery rhetoric, and a deep personal animosity. Nalundasan repeatedly defeated Mariano in elections, delivering a series of political blows that humiliated the elder Marcos and tarnished his standing in the community. The most significant of these defeats occurred during the 1935 National Assembly elections. On September 20, 1935, Nalunderson emerged victorious once again, securing his place as the dominant political figure in Ilocos Norte. The victory celebrations in Baytac, where both families resided, were jubilant and loud, a pointed reminder of Mariano's failure to reclaim his seat. The assassination of Julio Nalunderson, the very next day, September 21, 1935, the joyous atmosphere surrounding Nalunderson's victory turned to shock and grief. That evening, while he was at his home in Baytac, Julio Nalunderson was assassinated. A single rifle shot, fired through an open window, struck him fatally, ending his life and plunging the town into turmoil. The murder sent shockwaves through the community, as it was seen not merely as a personal tragedy but as an attack on the democratic process itself. Suspicion quickly fell on the Marcos family, given the bitter political rivalry and the timing of the assassination. The crime created a scandal that consumed Ilocos Norte and drew national attention, marking a turning point in the lives of all involved. The arrest and trial of Ferdinand Marcos. In December 1938, Ferdinand Marcos, then a young law student at the University of the Philippines, was arrested and charged with the murder of Julio Nalunderson. He was not alone in facing these allegations. His father, Mariano, and two uncles, Pio Marcos and Quirino Lizondo, were also accused of conspiring to commit the crime. The prosecution argued that the Marcoses, humiliated by Nalunderson's repeated electoral victories, had plotted to eliminate him in a desperate bid for political revenge. The evidence against Ferdinand was compelling. Witnesses testified that the four men had discussed plans to assassinate Nalunderson, with Ferdinand ultimately tasked to carry out the act. As a member of the UP rifle team and a national rifle champion, Ferdinand possessed the skill and precision required for such a task. Investigators further discovered that a rifle from the university's armory, specifically one belonging to the team captain, Teodoro M. Calor Jr., had gone missing and was later identified as the murder weapon. Of all the accused, only Ferdinand had access to the armory, making him the prime suspect. The case proceeded swiftly, and in late January 1939, the accused were denied bail. Ferdinand, just 21 years old at the time, found himself at the center of a legal and media storm. His future, once brimming with promise, now hung in the balance as he faced the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. The conviction and appeal. In late 1939, Ferdinand Marcos and Quirino Lizondo were convicted of murder and sentenced to 10 to 17 years in prison. Mariano and Pio Marcos were acquitted, but the damage to the family's reputation was immense. For Ferdinand, the conviction was a devastating blow, yet it also marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary legal comebacks in Philippine history. Determined to clear his name, Ferdinand took his case to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. The appeal became a high-profile legal battle that captivated the nation. It was during this period that Ferdinand demonstrated the full extent of his legal acumen. Despite being the accused, he took an active role in preparing his defense, meticulously analyzing the evidence, crafting arguments, and even personally drafting parts of the legal brief submitted to the court. This unusual involvement showcased Ferdinand's extraordinary intellect and unwavering confidence in his abilities. The Supreme Court appeal also brought Ferdinand into contact with some of the most influential figures in Philippine law and politics. Among them was Justice Jose P. Laurel, who wrote the majority decision in the case. Laurel, a towering figure in Philippine jurisprudence, reportedly saw a reflection of his younger self in Ferdinand. Years earlier, Laurel had faced a similar situation, having been convicted of frustrated murder during his youth but later acquitted on appeal. This personal history may have influenced Laurel's decision to advocate for Ferdinand's acquittal. On October 22, 1940, the Supreme Court overturned Ferdinand's conviction, clearing him of all charges except contempt. The decision was a stunning reversal that not only restored Ferdinand's freedom but also redeemed his reputation. For Ferdinand, the case became a badge of honor, a testament to his resilience, intellect, and ability to triumph against overwhelming odds. The legacy of the Nalunderson case, the assassination of Julio Nalunderson and the subsequent trial left an indelible mark on Ferdinand Marcos's life. It was a crucible that tested his character, sharpened his legal skills, and introduced him to the intricate world of Philippine politics and power. The case also revealed Ferdinand's remarkable capacity for reinvention. Rather than allowing the episode to define him negatively, he used it as a springboard for his ambitions, presenting himself as a victim of circumstance and a survivor of adversity. For the Marcos family, the case was both a tragedy and an opportunity. While it tarnished their name in the short term, Ferdinand's eventual acquittal and legal triumph allowed them to reclaim a sense of dignity and purpose. The experience forged in Ferdinand a belief in his own destiny, a conviction that he was meant for greatness, no matter the obstacles in his path. Decades later, Ferdinand would reference the Nalunderson case as a pivotal moment in his life, a chapter that demonstrated his capacity to overcome even the most daunting challenges. It became part of the mythos he crafted around himself, a narrative of resilience, intellect, and unyielding determination that would define his rise to power. Part 4: World War II and the myth of the war hero. Ferdinand Marcos's military service during World War II remains one of the most debated and controversial chapters of his life. From his initial enlistment to his post-war claims of heroism, this period was characterized by a blend of genuine service, personal ambition, and the construction of a narrative that would shape his political career for decades. The story of Ferdinand Marcos during the war is one of both courage and controversy, as well as myth-making on an extraordinary scale. Early days, from ROTC to active duty, before the outbreak of World War II, Ferdinand Marcos received military training as a member of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, while studying at the University of the Philippines. This training provided him with the foundational skills required for military service and instilled in him a sense of discipline and structure. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, thrusting the Philippines into the global conflict, Marcos was already prepared to serve. Marcos was activated for duty in the summer of 1941, joining the United States Armed Forces in the Philippines, USAFIP, as a third lieutenant. During the initial stages of the war, the Philippines faced relentless attacks from Japanese forces, and the American-Filipino defense effort, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, was marked by strategic retreats and significant losses. Marcos's service during this chaotic period saw him stationed in northern Luzon, where he participated in various defensive operations. As the Japanese advance continued, Marcos, along with thousands of other soldiers, was captured and became a prisoner of war. This harrowing experience was a common fate for many Filipino and American servicemen during the fall of Bataan and Corregidor in 1942. According to Marcos's own accounts, he endured the brutal conditions of captivity before being released under mysterious circumstances. His release in August 1942 has been the subject of speculation, with some sources suggesting that his father, Mariano Marcos, collaborated with the Japanese as a propagandist, facilitating Ferdinand's freedom. The myth of Ang Mga Maharlika. Following his release from captivity, Marcos claimed to have organized a guerrilla unit known as Ang Mga Maharlika, the Freemen, which he said operated in northern Luzon from 1942 to 1944. According to Marcos, this guerrilla force consisted of 9,000 fighters who engaged in numerous acts of resistance against Japanese occupation forces. These claims, however, were later challenged by investigations that revealed significant discrepancies in the records. The U.S. Army conducted an extensive review of guerrilla operations in the Philippines after the war, verifying legitimate groups and recognizing their contributions. When Marcos submitted his claim for recognition of Ang Mga Maharlika, investigators found inconsistencies in the documentation and accounts provided. The unit was not recognized as a legitimate guerrilla force, and many of its purported exploits were dismissed as fabrications. Despite this, the narrative of Marcos as a guerrilla leader persisted, bolstered by his ability to weave these stories into a compelling narrative of heroism. Military decorations, fact and fiction. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Marcos's World War II narrative was his claim to be the most decorated war hero of the Philippines. During his 1962 senatorial campaign, Marcos asserted that he had received 33 medals and awards for his service, including the Distinguished Service Cross, the Medal of Honor, and numerous other decorations. These claims were instrumental in shaping his public image as a soldier-statesman, a figure of valor and sacrifice. However, subsequent investigations revealed that many of these medals were either unverified or outright fraudulent. The Washington Post, in a 1986 exposé, reported that only 2 of Marcos's claimed awards, the Gold Cross and the Distinguished Service Star, were awarded during the war. Both of these awards were later contested by his superiors, who argued that they were undeserved. The majority of the other medals were awarded in the 1960s, long after the war had ended, during a period when Marcos was actively cultivating his image as a war hero. Despite these revelations, Marcos's narrative of wartime heroism remained a cornerstone of his political identity. The image of a battle-hardened soldier who had fought valiantly against the Japanese resonated deeply with the Filipino public, particularly in the context of post-war nationalism and the desire for leaders who embodied strength and resilience. Post-war service and controversies. After the war, Marcos was formally discharged as a major in the 14th Infantry of the USAFIP in May 1945. His post-war activities included serving as a special prosecutor tasked with bringing collaborators to justice, a role that underscored his complex relationship with the legacy of the Japanese occupation. This position allowed Marcos to further distance himself from the allegations of his father's collaboration with the Japanese, reinforcing his image as a patriot committed to the rule of law. However, controversies surrounding Marcos's military service persisted. One notable issue was his self-promotion to the rank of lieutenant colonel, a claim that was disputed by U.S. military officials. Official records indicated that Marcos was recognized only as a major upon his discharge, yet he frequently referred to himself by the higher rank in communications and public appearances. This discrepancy became another point of contention in the narrative of his wartime exploits. The impact of the war on Marcos's political career. World War II had a profound impact on Ferdinand Marcos, shaping his worldview and providing the foundation for his political rise. The war allowed him to craft a narrative of heroism, resilience, and leadership that resonated with a nation seeking to rebuild and redefine itself after years of conflict and occupation. While the veracity of his claims has been widely questioned, the power of his storytelling was undeniable. The myth of Ferdinand Marcos as a decorated war hero became a key element of his political campaigns, helping him secure victory in the 1949 congressional elections and later propelling him to the Senate and ultimately the presidency. His wartime narrative, though contested, exemplified his ability to blend fact and fiction in a way that captivated the public and solidified his image as a leader of exceptional character and capability. The legacy of Marcos's wartime claims. The controversies surrounding Ferdinand Marcos's military service highlight the complex interplay between history, memory, and myth-making. While his actual contributions to the war effort remain a subject of debate, his ability to craft a narrative that resonated with the Filipino people underscores the power of storytelling in shaping political legacies. For Marcos, the war was not merely a chapter in his life, it was the crucible in which he forged the identity that would define his rise to power and his enduring influence on Philippine history. Part 5. Post-war political career and rise to national prominence. After the conclusion of World War II, Ferdinand Marcos returned to civilian life, but his experiences during the war, both real and embellished, had set the stage for his political ambitions. Determined to build a legacy beyond the battlefield, Marcos turned his attention to law, governance, and politics. This transition marked the beginning of a meteoric rise that would eventually see him ascend to the presidency of the Philippines, becoming one of the most controversial figures in the nation's history. Early legal career and role as special prosecutor. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Philippines faced the daunting task of rebuilding its economy, infrastructure, and institutions. Part of this effort included addressing the issue of collaboration with the Japanese occupation forces. In this context, Ferdinand Marcos was appointed as one of the 11 lawyers serving as special prosecutors under the Office of the Solicitor General. His role was to bring collaborators to justice, holding those who had betrayed their country accountable for their actions. This position provided Marcos with an opportunity to showcase his legal acumen and dedication to the rule of law. It also allowed him to distance himself from the shadow of his father's alleged collaboration with the Japanese, positioning himself instead as a champion of justice and a defender of the Filipino people. The trials of collaborators were highly publicized, and Marcos's involvement in these cases helped to solidify his reputation as a brilliant and ambitious young lawyer. Entry into politics, congressional career, 1949 to 1959. Ferdinand Marcos's foray into politics came in 1949 when he decided to run for a seat in the House of Representatives, representing the 2nd District of Ilocos Norte. This district had previously been represented by his father, Mariano Marcos, before the latter's political career was cut short by his execution during World War II. By running for this position, Ferdinand sought to reclaim his family's political legacy and restore the Marcos name to prominence. Marcos ran as a candidate of the Liberal Party, which had emerged as a dominant political force in the post-war period. His campaign was characterized by a mix of charisma, populist rhetoric, and a compelling personal narrative. He presented himself as a war hero who had fought valiantly for the country's freedom, a narrative that resonated deeply with voters in the wake of the war. Marcos won the election decisively, marking the beginning of a political career that would span decades. During his 3 consecutive terms in the House of Representatives, from 1949 to 1959, Marcos established himself as a skilled legislator and a tireless advocate for his constituents. He focused on issues such as economic development, veterans' rights, and infrastructure improvement, gaining a reputation as a hard-working and effective representative. Leadership within the Liberal Party. As a member of the Liberal Party, Marcos quickly rose through the ranks, becoming one of its most prominent voices on economic and political issues. He served as the party's spokesman on economic matters and chaired the House Neophytes Bloc, a group that included several future leaders of the Philippines, such as Diosdado Macapagal, Emmanuel Pelores, and Arsenio Lacson. These connections would prove invaluable as Marcos navigated the complex landscape of Philippine politics. Marcos's leadership skills were evident in his ability to build coalitions and negotiate across party lines. He was a member of several key committees, including those on commerce and industry, defense, and economic planning. His work on these committees allowed him to shape legislation on a wide range of issues, further enhancing his political profile. Senatorial career and transition to Nacionalista Party, 1959 to 1965. In 1959, Ferdinand Marcos took the next step in his political journey by running for a seat in the Philippine Senate. His campaign emphasized his accomplishments as a congressman and his vision for a more prosperous and independent Philippines. Marcos's message resonated with voters, and he won the election, becoming a senator at the age of 42. As a senator, Marcos continued to focus on economic development and national security, introducing significant bills that addressed pressing issues of the time. His legislative achievements further cemented his reputation as a capable and forward-thinking leader. In 1960, he became the Senate Minority Floor Leader, a position that allowed him to play a pivotal role in shaping debates and influencing policy. During this period, Marcos also made a strategic decision to switch political allegiances. He joined the Nacionalista Party, which was then led by President Carlos P. Garcia. This move was seen as a calculated step to position himself for higher office, as the Nacionalista Party offered a more direct path to the presidency. By aligning himself with the party in power, Marcos demonstrated his political acumen and ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Marcos's transition to the Nacionalista Party also reflected his pragmatic approach to politics. He understood the importance of building alliances and leveraging opportunities, even if it meant shifting loyalties. This flexibility would become a hallmark of his political career, enabling him to navigate the complexities of Philippine politics with remarkable success. Senate presidency and the path to the presidency, 1963 to 1965. In 1963, Ferdinand Marcos was elected as the President of the Senate, the highest-ranking position in the upper chamber of Congress. This achievement was a testament to his political skill and the respect he commanded among his peers. As Senate President, Marcos played a central role in shaping national policy and positioning himself as a statesman capable of leading the country. Marcos's tenure as Senate President was marked by his ability to balance competing interests and build consensus on critical issues. He introduced and supported legislation aimed at promoting economic growth, improving social welfare, and strengthening national defense. His leadership in the Senate further enhanced his public profile and solidified his credentials as a potential presidential candidate. By the mid-1960s, Ferdinand Marcos had emerged as one of the most influential figures in Philippine politics. His combination of legislative achievements, charismatic leadership, and strategic alliances positioned him as a frontrunner for the presidency. In 1965, he announced his candidacy for the highest office in the land, running under the banner of the Nacionalista Party. The 1965 presidential election was a pivotal moment in Philippine history. Marcos faced off against incumbent President Diosdado Macapagal, a fellow Ilocano and former ally in the Liberal Party. The campaign was fiercely contested, with both candidates presenting competing visions for the future of the country. Marcos ran a populist campaign that emphasized his credentials as a war hero, his legislative accomplishments, and his commitment to economic development. His slogan, "This nation can be great again," encapsulated his promise to restore the Philippines to a position of strength and prosperity. Marcos also capitalized on the weaknesses of Macapagal's administration, which had faced criticism for its handling of economic and social issues. Marcos's victory in the 1965 election marked the beginning of a new era in Philippine politics. His inauguration as the 10th President of the Philippines on December 30, 1965, was a moment of triumph for a man who had risen from humble beginnings to the pinnacle of power. It also set the stage for a presidency that would be characterized by both ambitious development programs and profound controversies. Part 6, First Term as President, 1965 to 1969. Ferdinand Marcos began his presidency on December 30, 1965, amid high hopes and a wave of optimism. The inauguration of the 10th President of the Philippines marked a significant milestone for a leader who had carefully crafted a public image of competence, patriotism, and visionary leadership. Marcos's campaign slogan, "This nation can be great again," resonated with a populace yearning for progress and stability. The early years of his presidency were characterized by ambitious programs, infrastructure development, and a deliberate effort to strengthen the country's economic and military capabilities. The inauguration and vision for the Philippines. The inauguration of Ferdinand Marcos was a grand affair, reflective of his vision for a strong and modern Philippines. Delivered with characteristic eloquence, Marcos's inaugural address outlined his commitment to revitalizing the nation's economy, addressing social inequalities, and asserting Philippine sovereignty on the global stage. He pledged to lead with courage and determination, portraying himself as a leader capable of navigating the complexities of governance and uplifting the Filipino people. Central to Marcos's vision was the idea of transforming the Philippines into a regional power. He believed that economic development and military strength were essential components of national greatness, and he emphasized these themes throughout his first term. The president's rhetoric inspired many, and his early initiatives were met with widespread approval. Infrastructure development and the rice, roads, and schools agenda. One of the hallmarks of Marcos's first term was his aggressive infrastructure program, which became known as the rice, roads, and schools agenda. Recognizing the importance of physical infrastructure in driving economic growth, Marcos prioritized the construction of roads, bridges, dams, and public buildings. His administration sought to improve transportation networks, facilitate trade, and connect remote areas to urban centers. Among the most notable infrastructure projects undertaken during this period was the construction of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, CCP, complex. The CCP became a symbol of Marcos's vision for cultural and artistic development, as well as a representation of his desire to showcase the Philippines on the international stage. While the CCP and other grand projects were celebrated as achievements, they also signaled the beginnings of what critics would later term the Marcos's edifice complex, a tendency to prioritize extravagant infrastructure for political and propaganda purposes. The administration also focused on agricultural development, with an emphasis on increasing rice production to achieve self-sufficiency. The introduction of new irrigation systems, improved farming techniques, and the distribution of high-yield rice varieties were part of this initiative. Although these efforts resulted in short-term gains, they were later criticized for failing to address the deeper structural issues in the agricultural sector, such as land distribution and rural poverty. Economic policies and foreign loans. To fund his ambitious development agenda, Marcos relied heavily on foreign loans. His administration secured funding from international financial institutions and foreign governments, using these resources to finance infrastructure projects and economic programs. While this approach allowed the government to undertake large-scale initiatives, it also laid the groundwork for significant debt accumulation that would haunt the Philippines in the years to come. During his first term, Marcos sought to attract foreign investment and promote industrialization. He implemented policies aimed at liberalizing trade, encouraging the establishment of export-oriented industries, and strengthening the manufacturing sector. However, these policies were often criticized for favoring elite interests and failing to address the needs of the broader population. Strengthening the military and expanding the armed forces. Marcos recognized the importance of the military as both a tool of governance and a means of asserting national sovereignty. Early in his presidency, he took steps to expand the armed forces and strengthen its capabilities. He cultivated close relationships with senior military officials, granting them extended tenures and prominent roles in civilian governance. These moves ensured loyalty within the ranks of the military and solidified its role as a key pillar of his administration. The president also aligned the Philippines closely with the United States, leveraging the country's strategic location during the Vietnam War. By sending a contingent of Filipino troops, known as the Philippine Civic Action Group, PhilCAG, to South Vietnam, Marcos gained the support of the Johnson administration and secured additional military aid. This decision, however, was met with criticism from domestic groups who opposed Philippine involvement in the conflict. Social challenges and rising tensions. Despite the initial optimism surrounding his presidency, Marcos faced significant social and economic challenges during his first term. Widespread poverty, income inequality, and rural underdevelopment remained persistent issues. While the administration's programs aimed to address these problems, their impact was often uneven and limited in scope. One of the most significant events during this period was the exposé of the Jabida massacre in March 1968. The massacre, in which Muslim recruits were reportedly executed by members of the armed forces of the Philippines on Corregidor Island, became a flashpoint for tensions between the government and the Muslim community in Mindanao. The incident sparked outrage among Filipino Muslims and contributed to the emergence of the Moro insurgency, a conflict that would persist for decades. Marcos's response to these challenges often involved a combination of public relations efforts and political maneuvering. He sought to maintain public support through grand displays of leadership and by emphasizing his administration's accomplishments. However, the underlying issues of inequality and social unrest continued to simmer, foreshadowing the difficulties that would arise in his subsequent terms. The campaign for re-election. As the end of his first term approached, Marcos set his sights on re-election, determined to become the first president of the Third Republic to win a second term. His campaign emphasized the accomplishments of his administration, portraying him as a transformative leader who had laid the foundation for a new era of national greatness. The election campaign was marked by intense competition and significant expenditures, with Marcos utilizing state resources and foreign loans to fund infrastructure projects and bolster his popularity. However, this aggressive spending strategy had economic consequences. The debt-driven spending during the re-election campaign triggered an inflationary crisis in late 1969, leading to rising prices and social discontent. Despite these challenges, Marcos won re-election, securing a second term and cementing his position as a dominant force in Philippine politics. Legacy of the first term. Ferdinand Marcos's first term as president was a period of ambitious programs, significant achievements, and emerging controversies. His focus on infrastructure development and economic growth earned him praise, but his reliance on foreign loans and the uneven impact of his policies raised concerns about long-term sustainability. The first term also highlighted his ability to navigate complex political landscapes, forge strategic alliances, and maintain a strong grip on power. The legacy of this period would shape the trajectory of Marcos's presidency, setting the stage for the dramatic events and profound transformations that would unfold in his subsequent terms. It was a time of both promise and peril, reflecting the dualities that would come to define Ferdinand Marcos's leadership and his impact on Philippine history. Part 7, Second Term and the Road to Martial Law. 1969 to 1972, Ferdinand Marcos's second term as President of the Philippines, beginning on December 30, 1969, marked a critical turning point in his administration and in the nation's history. While his re-election was a testament to his political skill and public appeal, it also ushered in an era of escalating political unrest, economic challenges, and social divisions. This period laid the groundwork for the eventual declaration of martial law, a decision that would define Marcos's presidency and reshape the Philippines for decades to come. The 1969 presidential election, a controversial victory. The 1969 presidential election was one of the most contentious in Philippine history. Marcos, running for a second term, faced a determined opposition led by Sergio Osmeña Jr., the candidate of the Liberal Party. Marcos's campaign was fueled by extensive state resources and foreign loans, which funded a massive infrastructure program designed to curry favor with voters. Roads, bridges, schools, and public buildings sprang up across the country, and Marcos emphasized these accomplishments in his campaign, presenting himself as a transformative leader. However, the election was marred by allegations of vote buying, electoral violence, and other forms of malpractice. Observers and critics describe the 1969 election as the dirtiest, most violent, and most corrupt in modern Philippine history. The term guns, goons, and gold became a shorthand for the tactics employed to secure votes, highlighting the extent of coercion and manipulation. Despite the controversies, Marcos won a decisive victory, becoming the first Philippine president to secure a second full term under the Third Republic. While his victory was a political triumph, it also exacerbated existing tensions and deepened divisions within the country. Economic challenges and the balance of payments crisis. Marcos's aggressive spending during the election campaign came at a significant cost. The administration's reliance on foreign loans to fund infrastructure projects and campaign expenditures triggered a balance of payments crisis in 1970. The Philippine peso, which had been pegged to the US dollar, was devalued, leading to inflation and economic instability. Prices of basic goods soared, and the purchasing power of ordinary Filipinos eroded, fueling public dissatisfaction. The economic crisis also drew attention to the growing disparity between the wealthy elite and the impoverished masses. Critics accused the Marcos administration of prioritizing the interests of influential families and foreign investors over the needs of ordinary citizens. This perception of inequality and favoritism added to the mounting social unrest that characterized Marcos's second term. Escalating social unrest, the first quarter storm, the economic difficulties of the early 1970s coincided with a surge in political activism and social unrest, particularly among students, labor groups, and leftist organizations. The protests reached a peak in the first 3 months of 1970, a period that came to be known as the first quarter storm. These demonstrations were driven by a combination of economic grievances, demands for political reform, and opposition to perceived government corruption and authoritarianism. The protests were notable for their scale and intensity. Student activists, inspired by global movements for social change, organized rallies and marches that drew tens of thousands of participants. Some of the most significant protests took place in Manila, where demonstrators clashed with police and security forces. The confrontations often turned violent, resulting in injuries and deaths on both sides. The first quarter storm exposed deep fissures in Philippine society. While some groups called for moderate reforms, others advocated for radical change, including the overthrow of the existing political and economic order. The Marcos administration responded with a combination of force and rhetoric, branding protesters as subversives and communists while attempting to project an image of strength and control. The Moro insurgency and the Jabida massacre, another source of unrest during Marcos's second term, was the growing tension between the government and the Muslim population in Mindanao. The roots of this conflict lay in long-standing grievances over land, political representation, and cultural marginalization. These issues came to a head in 1968 with the revelation of the Jabida massacre, in which Muslim recruits training for a covert military operation were allegedly executed by their superiors on Corregidor Island. The Jabida massacre became a rallying point for Muslim activists and leaders, who saw it as evidence of the government's disregard for their rights and lives. The incident contributed to the rise of the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, a separatist group that sought greater autonomy for Mindanao and its Muslim population. The conflict between the MNLF and the government escalated during Marcos's second term, adding another layer of complexity to the nation's challenges. The 1971 Constitutional Convention, in response to widespread calls for political reform, Marcos initiated a constitutional convention in 1971 to draft a new constitution for the Philippines. The convention was intended to address structural issues in governance and provide a framework for modernization. However, the process was marred by allegations of bribery and manipulation, with critics accusing Marcos and his allies of using the convention to consolidate power. One of the most controversial aspects of the convention was the proposal to shift from a presidential system to a parliamentary system. This change would have allowed Marcos to remain in power as prime minister beyond the two-term limit set by the 1935 Constitution. The debates over these proposals fueled suspicions about Marcos's intentions and deepened opposition to his administration. The Plaza Miranda bombing and the suspension of habeas corpus. The political climate reached a boiling point on August 21, 1971, when a rally of the opposition Liberal Party at Plaza Miranda in Manila was targeted in a deadly bombing. The attack killed several people and injured many others, including prominent political leaders. Marcos blamed the incident on communist insurgents, using it as justification to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and grant himself emergency powers. The suspension of habeas corpus marked a significant escalation in Marcos's response to dissent. Opposition leaders, activists, and suspected subversives were arrested and detained without trial, heightening fears of an authoritarian crackdown. While Marcos defended the measures as necessary for maintaining order, critics saw them as a prelude to martial law. The bombings of 1972 and rising authoritarianism, in the months leading up to the declaration of martial law, a series of bombings rocked Metro Manila, further destabilizing the political environment. The explosions, which targeted public buildings and infrastructure, were officially attributed to communist rebels. However, some investigations suggested that elements within the military or the government may have been involved, using the bombings as a pretext for expanding Marcos's powers. The atmosphere of fear and uncertainty created by these events allowed Marcos to present himself as the only leader capable of restoring stability and protecting the nation from chaos. By cultivating relationships with key military officials and leveraging the loyalty of his political allies, Marcos positioned himself for the dramatic step that would come next. The declaration of martial law. On September 23, 1972, Ferdinand Marcos announced the imposition of martial law under Proclamation No. 1081, citing the need to address widespread lawlessness, communist insurgency, and economic instability. Although the proclamation was dated September 21, its implementation caught many by surprise, as it effectively dissolved democratic institutions, curtailed civil liberties, and concentrated power in the hands of the president. The declaration of martial law marked the end of Marcos's second term in a constitutional sense, as it allowed him to rule by decree and extend his stay in power indefinitely. It was a turning point that transformed the Philippines from a democratic republic into a regime marked by authoritarianism, repression, and cronyism. Part 8, Martial Law Era, 1972 to 1981. The consolidation of power. On September 23, 1972, Ferdinand Marcos announced the implementation of martial law across the Philippines, citing threats from communist insurgents, social unrest, and economic instability. Although the proclamation bore the date of September 21, the timing of its public announcement reflected Marcos's penchant for symbolic numerology and strategic calculation. The declaration marked a dramatic shift in Philippine governance, as it granted Marcos sweeping powers and fundamentally altered the nation's political and social landscape. Martial law was presented as a means of restoring order and fostering national development, but it became a tool for consolidating power, suppressing dissent, and perpetuating an authoritarian regime. Proclamation No. 1081 and the justifications for martial law. Marcos justified martial law through a narrative of imminent crisis. The rise of the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, and its armed wing, the New People's Army, NPA, was framed as an existential threat to national security. The violent protests of the first quarter storm, the series of bombings in Metro Manila, and the Plaza Miranda bombing of 1971 were all cited as evidence of a nation on the brink of chaos. Marcos claimed that only decisive action could prevent the Philippines from descending into anarchy. While the official narrative emphasized the need for stability, critics argued that martial law was a pretext for extending Marcos's rule beyond the two-term limit set by the 1935 Constitution. The timing of Proclamation No. 1081 coincided with growing opposition to Marcos's policies and mounting challenges to his authority, suggesting that the declaration was as much about self-preservation as it was about national security. The immediate impact of martial law. The declaration of martial law ushered in a period of profound political and social upheaval. Democratic institutions, including Congress and local governments, were dissolved or rendered powerless. The Constitution was effectively suspended, allowing Marcos to rule by decree. The judiciary, while technically still operational, was subjugated to executive control, and the media was placed under strict censorship. Prominent opposition leaders, journalists, activists, and suspected subversives were arrested, including Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., a vocal critic of the Marcos regime. The military played a central role in enforcing martial law, and its influence grew significantly during this period. Marcos relied on loyal generals and military officials to maintain order, rewarding them with lucrative positions and privileges. This militarization of governance not only reinforced Marcos's control but also fostered a culture of impunity and abuse within the armed forces. The curtailment of civil liberties was one of the most immediate and visible effects of martial law. Freedom of speech, assembly, and the press were severely restricted, and dissent was met with harsh penalties. Widespread reports of human rights abuses, including arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings, painted a grim picture of life under martial law. Amnesty International and other organizations documented thousands of cases of abuse, highlighting the human cost of Marcos's authoritarian policies. The New Society and economic policies. Marcos framed martial law as the foundation of a Bagong Lipunan, or New Society, a vision of a restructured and revitalized Philippines. The rhetoric of the New Society emphasized discipline, order, and national development. Marcos promised to address the country's deep-seated problems, including poverty, corruption, and inequality, through sweeping reforms and centralized governance. Economically, the martial law era saw ambitious initiatives aimed at industrialization and infrastructure development. Major projects included the construction of roads, bridges, power plants, and cultural landmarks. These initiatives were funded by foreign loans, which increased dramatically during this period. While the infrastructure boom created a semblance of progress, it also deepened the country's dependence on external debt, with long-term consequences for economic stability. Marcos implemented agrarian reform policies that aimed to redistribute land and improve rural livelihoods. However, these reforms were widely criticized as superficial and ineffective. Large landowners, including those close to the Marcos family, found ways to circumvent the reforms, perpetuating the inequalities they were meant to address. Cronyism and corruption. One of the defining characteristics of the martial law era was the rise of crony capitalism. Marcos and his wife, Imelda, cultivated a network of loyalists and business allies who were granted monopolies, government contracts, and other economic privileges. Key industries, including sugar, coconut, and logging, were controlled by Marcos's cronies, who enriched themselves at the expense of the broader economy. The scale of corruption during the martial law years was staggering. Marcos and his associates amassed vast fortunes through kickbacks, embezzlement, and the exploitation of public resources. The ill-gotten wealth of the Marcos family, much of it hidden in offshore accounts and properties, became a symbol of the regime's excesses. Estimates of the total amount stolen range from $5 billion to $10 billion, making it one of the most significant cases of state plunder in modern history. Human rights abuses and opposition. The suppression of dissent under martial law led to widespread human rights violations. Political prisoners were subjected to torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. The Philippine constabulary and military units, such as the Intelligence Service of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, ISAF, and the Metrocom Intelligence and Security Group, MISG, were implicated in numerous abuses. Despite the climate of fear, resistance to the Marcos regime persisted. Underground movements, including the CPP-NPA and the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, intensified their efforts against the government. Civil society groups, religious organizations, and international human rights advocates also raised awareness of the abuses occurring under martial law. The 1973 Constitution and Plebiscite. In 1973, Marcos oversaw the adoption of a new constitution, which replaced the presidential system with a parliamentary one. The new constitution allowed Marcos to retain executive powers while also assuming the role of prime minister. The ratification process was highly controversial, with allegations of coercion and manipulation. Instead of a secret ballot, Marcos implemented a system of citizen assemblies, where public voting was conducted through viva voce, raising doubts about the legitimacy of the results. The 1973 Constitution formalized Marcos's authoritarian rule, providing a legal framework for his continued governance. It also marked a significant departure from the democratic principles enshrined in the 1935 Constitution, deepening the erosion of the country's democratic institutions. The early years of martial law, public perception and propaganda. In the initial years of martial law, Marcos enjoyed a degree of public support, particularly from those who viewed his actions as necessary for restoring order. crime rates reportedly declined, and the visible progress of infrastructure projects created an illusion of stability and development. The regime invested heavily in propaganda, promoting the achievements of the new society and portraying Marcos as a benevolent and visionary leader. However, as the years passed, the economic and social costs of martial law became increasingly evident. The burden of foreign debt, the concentration of wealth among the elite, and the suppression of civil liberties eroded public confidence in the regime. By the late 1970s, discontent was growing, setting the stage for the eventual unraveling of Marcos's rule. Part 9: The Final Years of Marcos's Rule and the People Power Revolution, 1981 to 1986. The latter years of Ferdinand Marcos's presidency marked a period of deepening political turmoil, economic decline, and growing resistance to his authoritarian regime. Although martial law was officially lifted in 1981, the Philippines remained under the shadow of Marcos's authoritarian rule. His efforts to maintain control through political maneuvering and repression only intensified public discontent, culminating in the historic People Power Revolution of 1986, which ended his two-decade rule. Lifting martial law was a hollow gesture. On January 17, 1981, Marcos announced the formal lifting of martial law, proclaiming the Philippines' return to constitutional rule. This decision was largely symbolic, intended to placate growing domestic and international criticism of his regime. While the declaration marked the end of martial law in name, the structures of authoritarian control remained firmly in place. Marcos continued to rule through decrees, and the 1973 Constitution provided him with broad powers to suppress dissent. The timing of the announcement was strategic, coinciding with the planned visit of Pope John Paul II to the Philippines. Marcos sought to use the Pope's visit as an opportunity to improve his international image, presenting himself as a leader committed to democratic reform. However, the lifting of martial law did little to address the underlying issues of political repression, corruption, and economic instability that plagued his administration. The 1981 presidential election, following the lifting of martial law, the Philippines held its first presidential election in over a decade on June 16, 1981. Marcos ran for re-election under the newly established Kilusang Bagong Lipunan (KBL) party, facing minimal opposition after major opposition parties, including the United Nationalist Democratic Organization, UNIDO, and Laban, boycotted the election. The boycott was a response to the perceived lack of fairness in the electoral process, as Marcos retained control over the Commission on Elections, COMELEC, and other key institutions. Marcos won a landslide victory, securing another 6-year term in an election widely criticized as a sham. The results underscored the extent to which the democratic process had been undermined under his regime. The 1981 election reinforced the perception that Marcos was unwilling to relinquish power, further alienating opposition groups and ordinary citizens. Economic decline and growing discontent. The early 1980s were a period of economic crisis for the Philippines. The Marcos administration's reliance on foreign loans during the martial law years had left the country deeply in debt. The global economic downturn of the early 1980s, combined with rising interest rates and declining export revenues, exacerbated the nation's financial woes. By 1983, the Philippine economy was in free fall, with inflation soaring, unemployment rising, and poverty worsening. The economic collapse eroded the legitimacy of the Marcos regime, as ordinary Filipinos bore the brunt of the crisis. Public services deteriorated, and discontent grew among various sectors of society, including labor unions, student groups, and middle-class professionals. The economic decline also exposed the corruption and inefficiency that had characterized Marcos's governance, further fueling calls for change. The assassination of Benigno Aquino Jr., the turning point in the opposition to Marcos, came on August 21, 1983, with the assassination of Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., a prominent opposition leader and former senator. Aquino, who had been imprisoned during martial law and later allowed to go into exile in the United States, returned to the Philippines despite warnings of danger. He was assassinated on the tarmac of Manila International Airport, just moments after arriving. Aquino's assassination shocked the nation and galvanized opposition to Marcos. The public outcry was immediate and widespread, with many Filipinos blaming the regime for the killing. The incident became a rallying point for the opposition, uniting various groups in their demand for justice and political reform. Aquino's widow, Corazon Cory Aquino, emerged as a symbol of resistance, embodying the hopes of millions of Filipinos for a peaceful transition to democracy. The snap election of 1986, faced with mounting domestic and international pressure, Marcos announced in late 1985 that a snap presidential election would be held in February 1986, more than a year before his term was set to end. The decision was intended to demonstrate his continued popularity and legitimacy, but it also reflected the growing challenges to his rule. The opposition united behind Corazon Aquino, who ran as the candidate of the Unido coalition. The campaign was marked by stark contrasts between the two candidates. Marcos emphasized his experience and achievements, while Aquino represented change, integrity, and the promise of democratic renewal. The election became a referendum on Marcos's rule, with the future of the Philippines hanging in the balance. The snap election, held on February 7, 1986, was marred by widespread reports of fraud, violence, and intimidation. The official results declared Marcos the winner, but independent observers, including the National Movement for Free Elections, NAMFREL, reported significant irregularities that indicated Aquino had won. The blatant electoral manipulation further inflamed public anger, setting the stage for a dramatic showdown. The People Power Revolution. The tipping point came on February 22, 1986, when Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and Armed Forces Vice Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos announced their defection from the Marcos regime. Fearing retaliation, they sought refuge in Camp Aguinaldo and Camp Crame, calling on the public to support their rebellion. The announcement triggered a massive outpouring of support, as millions of Filipinos took to the streets in what became known as the People Power Revolution. The revolution, centered along Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, EDSA, in Metro Manila, was a remarkable display of non-violent resistance. Armed only with prayers, rosaries, and flowers, ordinary citizens confronted military tanks and soldiers, appealing to their sense of patriotism and humanity. The Catholic Church, led by Cardinal Jaime Sin, played a pivotal role in mobilizing the public and calling for peaceful protest. As the protests grew, key elements of the military and police defected to the opposition, leaving Marcos increasingly isolated. By February 25, 1986, the tide had turned decisively against him. That morning, Corazon Aquino took her oath of office as President of the Philippines in a simple ceremony at Club Filipino. Hours later, Marcos held his own inauguration at Malacanang Palace, but it was clear that his grip on power had been irreparably weakened. The fall of Ferdinand Marcos. On the evening of February 25, 1986, Ferdinand Marcos and his family fled Malacanang Palace, boarding helicopters provided by the United States and eventually seeking asylum in Hawaii. The departure marked the end of his 21-year rule and the beginning of a new chapter in Philippine history. When protesters stormed the palace shortly after the Marcos family's departure, they found a trove of luxurious possessions that symbolized the regime's excesses, including Imelda Marcos's infamous collection of over 2,700 pairs of shoes. The images of these discoveries became enduring symbols of the corruption and extravagance that had defined the Marcos era. Legacy of the People Power Revolution. The People Power Revolution was a defining moment in Philippine history, demonstrating the power of collective action and non-violent resistance. It inspired similar movements around the world, from Eastern Europe to Asia, and cemented the Philippines' reputation as a beacon of democracy. For Ferdinand Marcos, the revolution marked a dramatic fall from grace. The once powerful leader was now a figure of exile and controversy, his legacy tarnished by allegations of corruption, human rights abuses, and economic mismanagement. Yet his influence on Philippine politics would persist, with members of his family and loyalists continuing to play significant roles in the years that followed. Part 10: Exile in Hawaii and the Legacy of Ferdinand Marcos, 1986 to 1989. The ouster of Ferdinand Marcos in February 1986 marked the end of his two-decade rule over the Philippines, a period that had seen extraordinary highs and devastating lows. His dramatic departure from Malacanang Palace and subsequent exile in Hawaii were the final chapters of a political career that had reshaped the Philippines but left a legacy of division, controversy, and unresolved questions. During his years in exile, Marcos remained a polarizing figure, continuing to influence Filipino politics from afar, while his family sought to rebuild their fortunes and reputation. Exile in Hawaii. The Marcoses in transition. On February 26, 1986, Ferdinand Marcos, his wife Imelda, and a close circle of family members and allies arrived at Hickam Air Force Base in Honolulu, Hawaii, aboard U.S. Air Force planes. The journey marked a dramatic fall from power for the man who had ruled the Philippines with an iron grip for over 2 decades. The Marcoses brought with them a significant amount of wealth, including cash, jewelry, and gold bullion, much of which was later documented in U.S. Customs records. These assets became the focus of legal battles and investigations in the years that followed, as they symbolized the regime's corruption and excess. In Hawaii, the Marcos family initially lived in relative seclusion, residing in a luxurious mansion in Marquis Heights. Despite being in exile, Ferdinand Marcos remained active in attempting to influence Philippine politics. He maintained contact with loyalists in the Philippines and sought to frame his ouster as a betrayal by both domestic and international forces. Through carefully orchestrated statements and interviews, he continued to project an image of himself as a misunderstood patriot, committed to the welfare of the Filipino people. The U.S. government, which had facilitated the Marcoses' exile, faced criticism for its handling of the situation. While American officials emphasized that Marcos would not be granted immunity from legal action, the perception that the United States had sheltered a corrupt dictator fueled anti-American sentiment among many Filipinos. The Reagan administration's close ties to Marcos, forged during the Cold War, became a subject of controversy as new details about the regime's abuses emerged. Legal challenges and the hunt for ill-gotten wealth. One of the primary focuses of Ferdinand Marcos's years in exile was the legal battle over his wealth. The Philippine government, under President Corazon Aquino, established the Presidential Commission on Good Government, PCGG, to recover assets that the Marcoses had allegedly stolen during their time in power. The commission pursued cases in courts around the world, seeking to identify and reclaim billions of dollars in assets held in Swiss bank accounts, real estate, and other investments. The scale of the Marcos family's ill-gotten wealth was staggering. Estimates of the total amount embezzled during his presidency ranged from $5 billion to $10 billion, making it one of the largest cases of corruption in modern history. While the PCGG achieved some successes in recovering assets, the process was slow and fraught with legal and bureaucratic challenges. The Marcoses' extensive financial network and their ability to hire top legal teams made it difficult for the Philippine government to secure definitive victories. Despite these efforts, much of the Marcos wealth remained elusive. The issue of ill-gotten wealth became a symbol of the broader struggle for accountability and justice in the Philippines, underscoring the difficulties of addressing the legacies of authoritarian rule. Marcos's final years. In his final years, Ferdinand Marcos faced declining health, suffering from a range of ailments, including kidney disease and heart problems. His condition required frequent medical attention, and his once formidable presence diminished as he became increasingly frail. During this time, Marcos reportedly expressed a desire to return to the Philippines, not only to clear his name but also to be buried in his homeland. In 1989, Marcos proposed a controversial deal to the Aquino government. He offered to return 90% of his wealth to the Philippine people in exchange for permission to return home and spend his final days in his country. The offer was met with skepticism and ultimately rejected, as it was viewed as an attempt to evade accountability while preserving his family's fortune. On September 28, 1989, Ferdinand Marcos passed away at St. Francis Medical Center in Honolulu. He was 72 years old. His death marked the end of an era, but the controversies surrounding his rule and his family's legacy continued to shape Philippine politics and society. The controversial burial of Ferdinand Marcos. Following his death, Ferdinand Marcos's body was embalmed and placed in a private mausoleum in Hawaii. The Marcos family petitioned for his remains to be repatriated to the Philippines, but the Aquino government refused, citing concerns about public outrage and the potential for unrest. It was not until 1993, under the administration of President Fidel Ramos, that Marcos's body was allowed to return to the Philippines. His remains were interred in a refrigerated crypt in his hometown of Baytag, Ilocos Norte, where they became a focal point for supporters and tourists alike. The question of Marcos's final resting place remained a contentious issue for decades. In 2016, President Rodrigo Duterte authorized the burial of Marcos at the Libingan Nga Bayani Hero Cemetery in Taguig, sparking widespread protests. Critics argued that honoring Marcos with a hero's burial was an affront to the victims of his regime's abuses and a distortion of history. Supporters, however, viewed the burial as a recognition of his contributions to the country and a gesture of reconciliation. The legacy of Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand Marcos's legacy is one of profound complexity and enduring controversy. To his supporters, he is remembered as a visionary leader who championed infrastructure development, promoted nationalism, and sought to modernize the Philippines. To his critics, he is regarded as a corrupt and authoritarian ruler whose policies plunged the nation into economic hardship and whose regime was marked by widespread human rights abuses. The martial law years, in particular, remain a contentious period in Philippine history. While some credit Marcos with bringing stability and progress, others highlight the suppression of democracy, the rise of crony capitalism, and the human cost of his rule. The narratives surrounding his presidency reflect the deep divisions in Philippine society, as well as the challenges of reckoning with the past. The Marcos family continues to wield influence in Philippine politics, with Imelda Marcos and their children, including Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., playing prominent roles. Their return to power in various capacities underscores the enduring appeal of the Marcos name among segments of the population, as well as the persistence of historical amnesia and political polarization. Conclusion: Ferdinand Marcos's life and legacy encapsulate the complexities of Philippine history and governance. From his rise as a war hero and charismatic politician to his fall as a dictator ousted by a peaceful revolution, Marcos's story is both a cautionary tale and a reflection of the resilience of the Filipino people. His rule left an indelible mark on the nation, shaping its institutions, economy, and political culture in ways that continue to be felt today.